There we go. I've even got I've even got a post-it note saying press record. But because it's been there for over a week, do you think I look at it? No, I don't. Anyway, welcome. Switzerland. Fantastic. Absolutely amazing. Right, let's open this chat box up. Let's see where everyone's from. Toronto, Washington. Brilliant. Absolutely amazing. Please do keep letting me know where you're from. We will be starting shortly. I think everyone might be in. Is everyone in? Right, someone in the waiting room. Okay. So I'm just going to run through before I introduce Clifford to the talk. People are pinging off again. I hope everyone's all right with their tech. People that I've seen in the queue are now sort of rejoining. Anyway, welcome to Worldwide Doyle 2025, our second talk tonight. We host from the Conan Doyle Collection, the Worldwide Doyle Talks, in honour of Professor Neil McCall, who, right in the very early days of Portsmouth City Council welcoming the collection, was instrumental in guidance and help and understanding what we had, what we have got, and also the prominence and the huge jigsaw that it was that we had to put together. He then went on and did exhibitions for us. He wrote books. He was our personal expert. He was the one that we always went to. He was very much the person who we needed really to help us in those very early days. So we do the talks in honour of his dedication and time that he spent promoting for us, which is great. Tonight we have Clifford Goldfarb. Thank you so much for joining us. And we're here to talk about the potentially relationship between Conan Doyle and Charles Dickens, who was also born in Portsmouth. So, Cliff, over to you.
Thank you very much. Welcome from sunny Toronto. It's middle of the afternoon here, and I have no idea if I said good afternoon, good morning, good evening, I think I would get everybody, but hopefully that's enough. This talk actually began quite a few years ago when the Dickens Fellowship of Toronto invited me to speak about what would have happened if Charles Dickens and Arthur Conan Doyle had met. Instead, I talked about what occurred at a real meeting between them. It's been very enjoyable for me to revisit and update that talk. I assume most of you are aware of the social theory of 6 degrees of separation, the idea that anyone on this planet is 6 or fewer social connections away from anyone else, a theory first proposed by the Hungarian author Frigyes Karinthy in 1920. So, I started by assuming that Conan Doyle and Dickens had never met and asking how many steps it would take for their meeting. Then, for the fun of it, I set out to calculate how many steps it would have taken for me to be in contact with Dickens, and that's, of course, assuming that we were both alive at the same time. It starts with a book that I wrote about Conan Doyle's Napoleonic writings. I was very fortunate to be able to correspond with Dame Jean Conan Doyle, Arthur's daughter, who graciously wrote a foreword for the book. So, from me to Sir Arthur in just 2 steps. Now, if Arthur had met Charles face to face, that would get me there in 3 steps. I'll come back to the game in a while. First, a bit of context. Dickens died in London in 1870. Conan Doyle was only 11. He was living in Edinburgh and attending Stonyhurst School in Lancashire. There's no evidence that their paths crossed during those 11 years. If they had met, you can be certain that Conan Doyle would have written about it. In the very first chapter of his autobiography, Memories and Adventures, he wrote, "When my grandfather's grand London friends passed through Edinburgh, they used, to our occasional embarrassment, to call at the little flat to see how my father is getting on. In my earliest childhood such a one came, tall, white-haired, and affable. I was so young that it seems like a faint dream, and yet it pleases me to think that I have sat on Thackeray's knee. A similar meeting with Dickens would have produced at least a paragraph. So the closest we can come to a physical meeting in Dickens' lifetime is 2 degrees of separation. We can get there in more than one way, via Thackeray, who illustrated Dickens, or via Conan Doyle's grandfather, John Doyle, who was Dickens' parliamentary journalist colleague. Later, when John was a celebrated political cartoonist known as H.B., Dickens was a regular visitor to the Doyle home at 17 Cambridge Terrace in London, and Cambridge Terrace is now Sussex Gardens. Arthur's father, Charles Altamont Doyle, would have been present at some of those visits. Yet another meeting is via Conan Doyle's uncle, Richard or Dickie Doyle, a well-known Victorian illustrator. You might be familiar with his creation, the grinning Mr. Punch, who graced the cover of Punch magazine for 100 years. Dickie illustrated several of Dickens' works, including several volumes of the Christmas stories in 1845 and 6. So, for me, personally, 2 steps to Conan Doyle and 2 more to Dickens. I lived for a year in Sussex Gardens, but at the time I had no idea that the seedy-looking hotel on the east side of the square that I walked past each day was the former home of John Doyle. Attention, British Doyleans, it needs a blue plaque. There are other obvious connections between Charles and Arthur. Dickens was born in Portsmouth, and Conan Doyle set up his medical practice there in the suburb of Southsea in 1882. Today, there is the Charles Dickens Birthplace Museum in Portsmouth, and the Portsmouth History Centre is the home to the late Richard Lancelyn Green's wonderful Conan Doyle collection. In some ways, Conan Doyle could be a Dickensian character. His father was an alcoholic with artistic pretensions. As a boy, Conan Doyle was poor, but he had well-connected relatives, and with their support, he was able to get an excellent education. In his youth, his mother formed a relationship of a somewhat mysterious nature with a wealthy benefactor, Dr. Brian Waller, who certainly advanced Conan Doyle's cause. Then his first business relationship as a qualified doctor was with George Turnavine Budd, a medical school classmate and a bona fide rascal who cheated him out of money that was his due. Finally, having renounced his Catholic faith and cut himself off from the support of his devoutly religious family, he had to make his own way in the world, and, propelled by his talent and perseverance, became a great success as a writer. Parallels with Dickens are many. Both had fathers who were financial weaklings. Both had to make their own way in the world. Both were renowned for their readings. Conan Doyle did some amateur theatrics, but not on the level of Dickens. Conan Doyle was certainly less promiscuous in his marital relations than Dickens, or at least more circumspect. Both espoused social causes, Dickens mostly in his fiction, and Conan Doyle mostly everywhere but his fiction. Conan Doyle was more than just an admirer of Dickens. He actively supported his memory. On February 8, 1904, Conan Doyle, who was a vice president of the Dickens Fellowship, attended Dickens' 100th birthday anniversary at the Memorial Hall in London. On February 24, 1911, he spoke at the Mansion House, London, in support of the launch of the Dickens stamp, a scheme under which a 1 penny royalty stamp would be placed in copies of Dickens's works, with proceeds going to support his descendants. Before I do get to that real meeting between Dickens and Conan Doyle, and since Dickens died before Conan Doyle started publishing, I can't tell you what Dickens would have said about Conan Doyle's writing, but there's a lot that Conan Doyle had to say about Dickens. Writing about Sir Walter Scott in his book on literature, Beyond the Magic Door, Conan Doyle said, "Digression and want of method and order are traditional national sins. Fancy introducing an essay on how to live on nothing a year, as Thackeray did in Vanity Fair, or sandwiching in a ghost story, as Dickens has dared to do. But in his own writings, for example, Uncle Bernac, with a digression on life at Napoleon's court equal to almost 1/3 of the novel, Conan Doyle proved himself just as guilty of such a literary crime." About the state of English literature in the same book, he wrote, Which are the great short stories of the English language? Not a bad basis for a debate. This I am sure of, that there are far fewer supremely good short stories than there are supremely good long books. It takes more exquisite skill to carve the cameo than the statue. The great masters of our literature, Fielding, Scott, Dickens, Thackeray, Reed, have left no single short story of outstanding merit behind them. Later, he considered Bret Harte's The Luck of Roaring Camp and Tennessee's Partner and concluded, they are, it is true, so tinged with Dickens as to be almost parodies of the master, but they have a symmetry and a satisfying completeness as short stories to which Dickens himself never attained. Here we have to give Conan Doyle great respect because he was a superb writer of short stories. I will put at least two of his Brigadier Gerard stories in competition with any short stories you may care to nominate. The distinguished literary critic Owen Dudley Edwards wrote that just as War and Peace is the greatest historical novel, so the Brigadier Gerard stories are the greatest historical short story series. Conan Doyle refers frequently to Dickens and Dickensian characters in his personal letters and memoirs. He writes of his primary school days that from the age of 7 to 9, I suffered under this pockmarked, one-eyed rascal who might have stepped from the pages of Dickens. Other letters will refer to Bill Sikes, Pickwick, Mr. Micawber, the influence of Dickens on his writing, and emulating Dickens' success of reading his own stories on lecture tours. We could compare the writing styles of Dickens and Conan Doyle, but they are quite dissimilar. Let me preface my next comments by saying that Dickens is one of my favorite authors. I love reading his lush, orotund language. Contrast just a few paragraphs from the opening of one of his novels with the opening of one of Conan Doyle's. I've picked Bleak House, my favorite Dickens novel, partly because it is one of the earliest detective stories, and partly because it typifies Dickens' attitude to the English legal system. And I'm not being critical here, just comparing styles. Dickens wrote a long preface to the novel, but I'm starting with the opening paragraphs. In Chancery, London, Michaelmas term lately over, and the Lord Chancellor sitting in Lincoln's Inn Hall, implacable November weather, as much mud in the streets as if the waters had but newly retired from the face of the earth. And it would not be wonderful to meet a megalosaurus, 40 feet long or so, waddling like an elephantine lizard up Holborn Hill. I'm going to skip here. Fog everywhere. Fog up in the river, where it flows among green aits and meadows. Fog down the river, where it rolls defiled among the tiers of shipping and the waterside pollutions of a great and dirty city. Fog on the Essex marshes, fog on the Kentish heights, fog creeping into the cabooses of collier brigs, fog lying out on the yards and hovering in the rigging of great ships, fog drooping on the gunwales of barges and small boats, fog in the eyes and throats of ancient Greenwich pensioners wheezing by the firesides of their wards, fog in the stem and bowl of the afternoon pipe of the wrathful skipper down in his close cabin, fog cruelly pinching the toes and fingers of his shivering little prentice boy on deck. I'm going to skip some more here. The raw afternoon is rawest, and the dense fog is densest, and the muddy streets are muddiest, near that leaden-headed old obstruction, appropriate ornament for the threshold of a leaden-headed old corporation, Temple Bar. And hard by Temple Bar in Lincoln's Inn Hall, at the very heart of the fog, sits the Lord High Chancellor in his High Court of Chancery. Never can there come fog too thick. Never can there come mud and mire too deep to assort with the groping and floundering condition which this High Court of Chancery, most pestilent of hoary sinners, holds this day in the sight of heaven and earth. One of my favorite novel beginnings, wordy, atmospheric, 490 delightful words in full, not the least bit to the point. Now, here are two of the opening paragraphs of the Sherlock Holmes story, Five Orange Pips. Another story that I identify with because one of its minor characters, Fordham the Horsham lawyer, is my investiture or nom de plume with the Baker Street Irregulars. The story actually starts with two paragraphs that serve to provide continuity with previous tales and to give us a tantalizing glimpse of the sort of tales that Conan Doyle might provide if he were so inclined, but alas, never got around to. It was in the latter days of September, and the equinoctial gales had set in with exceptional violence. All day the wind had screamed and the rain had beaten against the windows, so that even here in the heart of great handmade London, we were forced to raise our minds for the instant, from the routine of life, and to recognize the presence of those great elemental forces which shriek at mankind through the bars of his civilization like untamed beasts in a cage. As evening drew in, the storm grew higher and louder, and the wind cried and sobbed like a child in the chimney. Sherlock Holmes sat moodily at one side of the fireplace, cross-indexing his records of crime, while I, at the other, was deep in one of Clark Russell's fine sea stories, until the howl of the gale from without seemed to blend with the text, and the splash of the rain to lengthen out into the long swash of the sea waves. My wife was on a visit to her mother's, and for a few days I was a dweller once more in my old quarters at Baker Street. "Why," said I, glancing up at my companion, "that was surely the bell. Who could come tonight? Some friend of yours, perhaps?" "Except yourself, I have none," he answered. "I do not encourage visitors." After only 227 words and 5 orange pips, we are well into the story. Conan Doyle, perhaps because of his medical background, was a master of brevity, of creating pictures with only a few words, letting his reader supply the details. Admittedly, the Conan Doyle texts are from short stories, but his 4 Sherlock Holmes novels, as well as most of his other novels, begin with similar brevity. There's a quote which I have not been able to trace, which suggests that if there was a contest to find the British writer with the most succinct yet readable literary style, it would be hard to choose a winner between Conan Doyle and Rudyard Kipling. A number of commentators have pointed out the possible influence of Dickens on Conan Doyle's writing. My friend and writing collaborator Hartley Nathan suggests that Conan Doyle may have been thinking of Jarndyce versus Jarndyce, the lawsuit in Bleak House, when he made a state litigation the underlying basis of the plot in the Sherlock Holmes tale, The Reigate Squires. Dickens' Inspector Bucket was also undoubtedly influential in the development of Sherlock Holmes. Peggy McFarlane, the former curator of the Arthur Conan Doyle Collection at the Toronto Reference Library, points out several parallels between Conan Doyle's novella, a duet with an occasional chorus, and Dickens' Our Mutual Friend. In Duet, the new bride, Maud Cross, gets depressed when she's unable to memorize Mrs. Beeton's book of household management. This seems to have been inspired by a similar scene in Mutual Friend, when Bella Wilfer becomes overconcerned about following the recommendations of the complete British family housewife. In another scene in Duet, the newlyweds Frank and Maud try to convince the restaurant staff at their wedding dinner that they are a long-married couple. Bella and John Rokestone also do this shortly after they marry. Zach Dundas, author of The Great Detective, suggested that in the 1891 Sherlock Holmes story, The Man with a Twisted Lip, Conan Doyle took his description of the Bar of Gold, a deliciously foul opium den, a hive of scum, villainy, and Orientalism populated by sallow Malays and snifty Lascars, in which Watson finds Holmes disguised as an opium smoker, from The Mystery of Edwin Drood, which opens with a hallucinatory scene in an opium den. Dickens' den also featured various Asian mystery men, as well as an Englishwoman who'd opium smoked herself into a strange likeness of the Chinaman. No need to talk about their popularity. Each was the most popular British writer, maybe the most famous British man of his time. Well, if they did meet, what would they have to talk about? They had many things in common. Both were heavily interested in social causes. Both enjoyed a seat at the pinnacle of the writing establishment in their day. Both were successful public lecturers. One possible connection is one of the most unusual characters of the 19th century. In The Adventure of the Illustrious Client, Conan Doyle referred to the case of Vamberry the wine merchant, another tantalizing unwritten Sherlock Holmes tale. This was surely Arminius Vamberry, a famous Hungarian, professor of languages in Budapest, traveler in Central Asia, part-time spy for the British Foreign Office, and a frequent visitor to London. He started life Jewish, converted to Islam so he could safely travel in Muslim lands, and converted again to Christianity to qualify for a teaching position in Hungary. In 1865, Dickens met Vamberry at the Athenaeum Club and wrote an article about him, the Hungarian dervish, in his magazine All the Year Round. Conan Doyle quite possibly met Vamberry in 1892 through their mutual friend Bram Stoker. Stoker, of course, mentions Vamberry and Dracula as my friend Arminius of Budapest University. Maybe they would talk about their best-known literary characters, many of whom more than a century later are still part of the common knowledge of the culturally literate. Tiny Tim, Sherlock Holmes; Oliver Twist, Professor Challenger; Ebenezer Scrooge, Brigadier Gerard; Mr. Pickwick, Professor James Moriarty; David Copperfield, Dr. John Watson; Little Nell, Sir Nigel Loring. My own surmise, however, is they would only talk about two characters, Edwin Drood and Sherlock Holmes. There is a pretty voluminous amount of material written by others in which Conan Doyle, or more frequently Sherlock Holmes, and Dickens come together in some fashion. There are at least a dozen articles and a number of pastiches about Sherlock Holmes and the Mystery of Edwin Drood, the novel that Dickens left half completed on his death, without any notes or suggestions as to how the mystery was to be solved. Was Drood even dead? Had he been murdered? If so, by whom? Who is Datchery the detective? Likely, we will never know. Many are the mystery writers of note who have taken a stab at solving the mystery of the mystery. Conan Doyle was asked many times to help solve mysteries, often because some member of the public managed to attract his interest in righting a wrong or finding a missing person. You'd expect him to join the Drood industry and take a stab at solving the mystery, and you'd be right. Conan Doyle and the book reviewer Dr. Robertson Nicoll became friends, sharing a common interest in resolving Drood. In 1912, Nicoll published The Problem of Edwin Drood. Conan Doyle then sent Nicoll 6 pages of typescript with his own views, but he came to no conclusion on the definite solution of Drood. In an essay which appeared in the Fortnightly Review in 1927, Conan Doyle wrote about a continuation of Edwin Drood, which professed to come from Charles Dickens through the hand of one James, who was a foreman in a printing office in Brattleboro, Vermont. Conan Doyle thought it was an excellent imitation of the great author's style, but the most unconvincing part was the narrative itself, which was clumsy and improbable, and the actual inspiration of Dickens is far from being absolute established. It reads, he added, like Dickens gone flat. One major difference between Dickens and Conan Doyle was a belief in spiritualism. Dickens ridiculed it and openly dismissed it. Conan Doyle, on the other hand, dabbled in it from the 1880s and publicly espoused it in 1917. He was the world's foremost exponent of spiritualism until his death in 1930. But I still haven't delivered on my promise to tell you the story of the meeting between Dickens and Conan Doyle, and I see that time is running short, so I'd better get to it. In 1927, Conan Doyle and his wife arranged a séance in their home, conducted by Florizel von Reuter, a celebrated violinist, and his mother Grace. Conan Doyle published an account in 1927, and a revised version in The Edge of the Unknown, Chapter 6, Alleged Posthumous Writings of Great Authors, in 1930. He described how Madame von Reuter sits with her eyes tightly bandaged and her hand upon a small pointer which darts very rapidly at the letters of the alphabet while her son writes down the results. Imagine us there seated, these two at the center table, my wife and I in the corner of our cottage room. Dickens and Drood had been in my mind, but our visitors had no means of knowing that. Florizel Reuter had never read Edwin Drood. His mother had read it years ago, but had a very vague memory as to the book. Suddenly, the pointer begins to dart furiously, and Florizel reads off each sentence as he notes it down. Some of them, I may add, came in looking-glass writing and had to be read backwards. The first was, Boz is bussing about. Boz, of course, was the nom de plume of Dickens, so I asked if it was he. He eagerly declared that it was. After a short interchange of dialogue, I said, "Will you answer some questions?" "I hope I know enough," was the answer. "Was that American who finished Edwin Drood inspired?" "Not by me," was the instantaneous and decided answer. Then came a further message. Wilkie C. did or would have done better. That's Wilkie Collins. Was Edwin Drood dead? No, he was not. Then, after a pause, the message went on. I was sorry to go across before I got him out of his trouble. The poor chap has had a hard time. I don't know which is better, to solve the mystery in your notebook or let it remain a mystery forever. If you make good with Conrad, I will put you on to Edwin. I shall be honored, Mr. Dickens. Charles, if you please. We like friends to be friends. The reader will smile at this. So did I. But facts are facts, and I am giving them. I asked, have you a clear recollection of the plot? I have. Who was Datchery? Now comes the important sentence. Edwin is alive, and Chris is hiding him. Conan Doyle is, of course, talking about the Reverend Crisparkle hiding Edwin Drood, one possible ending to the novel. Von Reuter also published an account of the seance in which he quoted Dickens saying, I was sorry to go across before I got him out of his trouble. The poor chap has had a hard time. I always hoped that you would put Sherlock on his track. I don't know which is better, to solve your mystery in your notebook or let it remain a mystery. Conan Doyle was somewhat skeptical about this solution. After analyzing it, he did allow that the well-known illustration by Luke Fildus, drawn under Dickens' very particular direction, contains small vignettes of various scenes. One of which shows Drood standing in a sort of vault, and someone who has some indications of clerical garb coming into him with a lantern. Is this not Crisparkle, and is it not some corroboration of the spirit message? To be fair to Conan Doyle, he did not claim that Dickens had been raised. I do not insist upon Charles Dickens. If anyone says to me, how can you prove that it was not an impersonation? I would admit frankly that I cannot prove it. There is none of that corroboration from style which I get in the case of Oscar Wilde and of Jack London. I claim that it was the most evidential case of intelligence outside our own physical bodies. Of course, I take this account of a meeting between Conan Doyle with Dickens or his emissary with a grain of salt, perhaps an entire pillar of salt. Still, Conan Doyle believed that he had made this contact and that the meeting was more than a hypothetical one. And if that meeting really did take place, then at long last we know the solution to the mystery of Edwin Drood, and my degree of separation with Dickens is reduced to 3. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. That was really fascinating. I'm sure. Yeah, well, let's just wonder whether or not they're up there talking.
Mm,
Um, could be quite interesting, couldn't it?
yeah,
We
happy to
have
answer.
we have some questions, if that's all right.
Sure.
Let's have a look. Oh, wrong bit. Here we go. So feel free if you want to come off the mic as well, if you want to ask. So the first question is from Brenda. Did any Dickensian character exhibit the talent of Holmes' introspection? Interesting.
Um, well, there was, of course, Inspector Bucket in Bleak House. But I mean, Sherlock Holmes, as far as I'm aware, was the first character to achieve that level of the ability to solve problems using only his mind and his observations. A lot of the others, and Conan Doyle said it himself, got there by luck, or maybe they got there by just sheer perseverance. I can't think of, off the top of my head, I can't think of any Dickensian character, who was that kind of a sleuth.
Would anyone match Sherlock Holmes in intelligence, do you think, within the Dickens canons?
Maybe in The Tale of Two Cities, the, whose name I know is just I'm blanking on, but it's a far, far better thing I do than I've ever done before. Um, I don't know. It's really hard to pull things like that out of the air. I mean, Dickens' characters are, somewhat bluff. Mr. Pickwick. I don't know that there are any internal thinking going on in his
Yeah,
character.
yeah, yeah, yeah. They're very, very different writers, aren't they? Sydney
Yeah.
Carton, Claire has just
Penny
said.
Carton, right? Yes.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Lovely. Yeah, I think it's quite a difficult one, really, isn't it? But really interesting. I need to read a bit more. I love Dickens. I do need to read a bit more to refresh, I think. Um, who's the most Dickensian character in the canon? That's from Ross.
Um, yeah. Well, good question. Um, the the character that Holmes uses, who's an ex-con, who is his entree into the criminal underworld. Again, I'm horrible on names. Um,
Don't worry. Ross has said happy to hear a top three, if that helps.
Shenwell Johnson.
Chinwell Johnson, right?
Oh, well done.
Yeah, who is actually named after a man who was a trade union agitator who was later to become a member of Parliament and the British Minister of Defense, well after Conan Doyle's time. But I mean, for him, um, he's a roguish type of character that might have fit into Dickens. The problem is, again, that Conan Doyle's characters, for the most part, have reasonably similar names that you could find in a telephone book. And I don't think you would find any of Dickens' characters' names in a telephone book. And Conan Doyle actually wrote about that. I didn't mention that in my talk, but he kind of talked about how Dickens' characters had names that sort of made them unreal.
Mm, mm. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Druid and Bleak House are the two most well-known mysteries in Dickens, but would you speak about some of the others? OMF, etc. Not quite sure. Sorry, Karen.
I I'm not really sure I've read so many of Dickens' works. I don't think so many of them are really mysteries. They're more social, books about people overcoming great obstacles, or Miss Faversham. I don't see mysteries there. I'd be happy if someone wants to suggest one.
I think Karen suggested that Druid and Bleak House are the two most well-known mysteries. So
Right.
yeah, yeah, that makes sense. Um, yeah, maybe there's not others. Mary Morstan strikes me as a Dickensian angel of the house type. That's from Peggy.
Yeah.
And a great talk, Cliff.
Thank you, Peggy. Um, yes, although unfortunately, I don't think, for the most part, Conan Doyle develops his female characters very well, especially in shorter stories. Although Sign of Four is, long is a novella, but even so, I think his female characters to me are often caricatures,
Mm.
and he doesn't. I mean, I'm sure there are other novels where women are probably better developed, but I can't think of too many Conan Doyle novels in which he has female characters who are the center of anything. Maybe in a duet.
No, that's an interesting one. I've struggled at work trying to find female representation um, to
Mhm.
show an even playing field. It's quite hard, isn't it?
Yeah.
Not sure of pronunciation. Jabez Wilson is a bit eccentric, like a Dickensian character. That's from Claire.
That's a possibility. I mean, the tattoos and the belief that he could, because of his red hair, be qualified for employment by the Red-Headed League.
Thaddeus Sholto is an eccentric in a Dickensian way.
Yes, to a certain extent. Obviously, the architecture and the lifestyle of the house. But again, no, those characters they're not central the way Dickens characters are.
Brenda has put, I don't know how much Oscar Wilde would appreciate this characterization.
Which character, Brenda, are you referring to? I mean, Oscar Wilde.
I meant Thaddeus Sholto.
Oh, because people have thought that he might be a caricature of
Right.
what with
Right.
yeah, possibly. But I mean, the problem is that in stories, Conan Doyle's stories, these characters are never really fully fleshed out, and you don't get to hear their point of view. They don't take a leading role in anything. They're just sort of accessories to to Sherlock Holmes.
Lovely. We've got a one from Jonathan Cranfield, who'll be on later on this lecture series season. Thanks, Cliff. I wondered how much ACDs and Conan Doyle's publishing environments influenced their differences in style. Sorry, that was Charles Dickens. Sorry, let me start. I wondered how much Arthur Conan Doyle and Charles Dickens' publishing environments influenced their differences in style. Dickens was encouraged to write at great length to help fill his own journals, whereas Arthur Conan Doyle was pushed towards brevity by the illustrated magazines where he largely published.
There's a possibility in that, but I mean, of course, Dickens also wrote lengthy novels. Many of them were serialized. Conan Doyle wrote novels that were serialized, and he wrote novels that were that weren't serialized, that were sort of complete. Dickens' novels are generally longer than Conan Doyle's novels. I'm struggling with Dickens didn't write historical novels, and Conan Doyle spent a lot of his writing career writing historical novels. And by the time Conan Doyle was writing his novels, perhaps the three-volume trend that had been there for most of the 19th century was no longer as strong. So I think that different environments. It's a point that could be considered. I haven't really thought about it.
Thank you, Karen. She's come back with some strong women. Irene Adler, naturally. Violet Hunter, Kitty Winter, Violet de Merville. So I'm going to go away and start searching those other ladies up.
They're all notable characters, but they're all in short stories to start with. And again, they're not the center of the story. They're a character in the story. They don't have their own. I mean, there's a certain extent in the Copper Beeches, I guess. Violet de Merville seems to me like a really weak character. I mean, she's bamboozled by this awful lover that goes around probably killing his lovers or doing something to them. I don't see them as really strong. I think Irene Adler definitely does. She does things that probably no other woman does in any of the Sherlock Holmes tales. And again, it's interesting because it was the very first of the short stories. And you could perhaps see her coming back as a character later on, as she does in many pastiches. I don't see very many of the other women as being a suitable character or being anyone that people would write pastiches about. Whereas Irene Adler, I think, really does have a separate identity compared to almost any of the other women in the canon. So she is the woman in the canon.
She's the one that most people know.
Yeah.
I seem to find. Thaddeus Sholto is eccentric in a Dickensian way. That's from TM.
Yes, I agree. He does have Conan Doyle does have characters who are somewhat eccentric. I mean, there's the schoolmaster and um, you know the who's oh, I never, it's funny. I've not been able to remember names for many years. I remember all the details, but I mean, there's a schoolmaster who comes and collapses on the floor of the house and of Conan Doyle, of Sherlock Holmes's rooms. Who's I think of him as a Dickensian character. There's the James Ryder, the thief of the jewel, who Sherlock lets off the hook. There are, Boscombe Valley Mystery, the ex-criminal who is killed and his son is suspected. I mean, there are all these characters, but they're not fully fleshed out. I mean, Jabez Wilson is close to, as close as, and Thaddeus Sholto, or maybe as close as it gets. There's the uh, I just think that his characters are not memorable because they have such a small role to play in the short stories.
Interesting. Has anyone got any more
My personal
questions
opinion,
at all? So we've got Brendan said, I don't know how much Oscar Wilde would appreciate this characterization. And Jonathan says he would very much have resented being made bald. That's for
yes,
sure. That's true.
yes. Well, this, the thing about, I mean, Oscar Wilde and Conan Doyle met in 1889, I think it was, and at the famous dinner at the Langham Hotel, and they became quite friendly. And clearly, Conan Doyle was observing that Wilde kept brushing his mouth with his hand, possibly to conceal the fact that he had very bad teeth. And then he puts these characteristics into him. But Oscar Wilde was very large, and Thaddeus Sholto was definitely not very large. Um, there's the question of taste, which I guess you could say that he tries to talk about, Thaddeus Sholto's Oriental tastes and decor and everything. Um, I guess it's a possibility. I mean, it's been suggested, but I sometimes wonder if we read too much into Conan Doyle.
Never.
No, I don't mean it. I don't mean it in a way that Conan Doyle is light. I mean in that Conan Doyle doesn't always have an ulterior motive in what he's doing, right?
No, but then I think that's true in a lot of authors, isn't it? And I think it's just our fascination, and it's like an onion, it's multi-layered, isn't it? I think you then impose onto everything your meaning and your, I don't know, this goes back to the talk that we had with the lovely Bert last week. I think memory and sort of, your sort of, I don't know. Yeah, I think
I
it's
mean,
everything can be multi-layered, can't it? The meanings can go on and on and on.
yeah. I mean, he has real people in the Brigadier Gerard stories and one or two of the other novels. Rodney Stone has more historical people than I think the rest of his writing combined. Um, and then he has his main characters. I mean, some of the historical people actually have important roles in the novel, but the main characters in the novel, I mean, the Rodney Stone's uncle, um, Buck Tregellis, is a real caricature, and he could be in a Dickens novel, and he's a Regency fop who, underneath all of that, is actually a very accomplished athlete and quite intelligent, but he has to play this role of, it sounds almost like a Regency fool,
Hmm.
modeled on Beau Brummel to a certain extent, the clothes horse of English society in the early 19th century. Um, I think he's capable of doing that, but I think he's not really into introspective characters, in his writing. His characters are more people of action.
Mm. Yeah, lovely. It's fascinating as always, isn't it? It's always food for thought. And every time I do this, my reading list gets longer and longer, and I'm sure everyone else is as well. I don't know if everyone else would have had to do this, but we read Dickens when we were at school. Sadly, not Sherlock. So that's come much later. But I think definitely there's a scope there, isn't there, of going back and rereading the stories. I know them through, sadly, through TV adaptations, which is just awful to say that, isn't it? So there you go.
Yeah.
Thank you. Has anyone else got any questions at all? Thank you all, as always. Is there anything else from you, Cliff?
No, I just I'm actually looking forward to visiting your collection this fall
Yeah,
and doing
that'd
some
be
research
great.
there for Rodney Stone. And
Yes.
if any of you are planning to be in Toronto at any time in the next little while, I'd love to invite you to come and visit the Toronto Reference Library to the Arthur Conan Doyle Collection, where Richard Lancelin Green spent many fruitful hours cataloging everything that Conan Doyle had ever written, if that we had in our library. So
Oh,
there
wow.
are connections.
Yeah. I'd love to come. Absolutely, definitely. That'd be amazing. Thank you so much. It's been wonderful to meet you. It's been lovely to see all of our lovely audience and lots of lovely familiar faces now as well. I'm really looking forward to, we've got another 2 lectures, so we will see you on the 25th, I think is the next one. So I look forward to seeing everyone then. Um, yeah, thank you all again. As always, I will save the video. It will go up onto the Doings of Doyle podcast, onto their YouTube channel, sorry, and we will have it on our website. Yeah, we'll stay in touch. We'll see you again next time.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
I'm just going to try and turn off the recording. Right, thank you.